Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Western Prosperity Roundtable inaugural forum. My name is Lauren Cloward, and I'm a policy advisor here at the Western Governors Association. High-speed internet access, a requisite for entrepreneurs and growing businesses, is foundational to community prosperity. Our first panel, Connectivity and Closing the Digital Divide, will explore how we can meet the vast need for broadband and ensure that everyone can work, learn, and receive medical care from their homes. We have a great lineup of speakers with us. Each of them will begin with a presentation describing their work, and then we will move into a moderated discussion. We encourage you to submit questions for our panelists using the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer them during the discussion. To kick us off, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Kathryn de Wit, Project Director of the Broadband Access Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trusts. Prior to Pew, she worked at Booz Allen Hamilton, where she provided consulting support to federal clients on broadband, economic development, and cybersecurity. Kathryn, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks so much, Lauren, and thank you for having me today and for pulling this panel together. We have a really great group of women here to talk about how we bridge the digital divide, which is always a fun thing to say. So just to provide a quick level set on me and my team's work before we jump into the panel. As Lauren said, I work for the Pew Charitable Trusts. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. Hopefully many of the folks listening today are familiar with the work from me and my colleagues as it touches on a very broad range of state issues. My team has spent the last 3 years looking at how states are responding to the digital divide, how they are using policy and programs to make meaningful progress on broadband availability within their jurisdictions. And what we found through the course of that research is that states are not only doing quite a bit, they're doing quite a bit well. And what they're doing well is relying on a series of activities in order to bridge the digital divide, not just funding. They are focusing on diverse stakeholder engagement to understand what the gaps and challenges are and to identify goals. They are establishing policy frameworks to create space for stakeholders to solve these problems. They are relying on statewide, regional, and local planning, not only to build buy-in into these concepts and to create strategies for moving forward, but also to build the expertise of community leaders across the state to make sure that they have the resources and knowledge to help participate in community-led broadband initiatives and public-private partnerships. Of course, states are committing significant funds to broadband. What we found in our analysis of 2020 legislative sessions that even amid a pandemic and an economic recession, states were committing historic amounts to their broadband deployment funds. And that's something that we anticipate will continue this year and into the coming years. Finally, we found that states are also evaluating their progress. Are they making the impact that they had intended? How do they adjust their policies and approaches in order to meet those goals? They really are truly trying to apply lessons learned to ensure that they are being effective stewards of public funds. Since this is the Western Governors Association, I would be remiss not to talk about the important role of governors and the role that we found governors play in supporting and promoting statewide broadband programs. And I think at its core, the strength of governors is by championing these issues. They are out in front saying that it's a priority for the state, that this connectivity is essential for the economic well-being of the state's future, for access to healthcare, for opportunities for education and training and mobility. Having governors out in front advocating and being the champions on this issue is incredibly important, not only because it just helps build momentum behind the issue, but because it also helps them work with state legislatures to make sure that they have they can pass the policies and allocate the resources to make sure that state programs can do what they need to do. Finally, when it comes to the role of governors, a really important piece is their ability to promote coordination within government. That interagency coordination is something that we found through the course of our research to be essential, because broadband is not just infrastructure. It's not just technology. It's something that touches libraries, education, healthcare. So that means that it touches a lot of other departments across state government. And when governors not only say, you know, broadband is a priority, we want to bridge the digital divide in our state, they say, and now we want all these agencies to work together in order to do it. That's really where we see meaningful change. So I will now turn it over to our panelists, who, as Lauren explained earlier, will have a couple minutes of presentation, and then we will move into a moderated Q&A. So please, again, feel free to add questions to the chat as we go through. But for now, we're going to start with Laura Spinning, who is the Deputy Associate Administrator for the National Telecommunications and Information Administration's broadband programs. Prior to joining NTIA, Laura spent 10 years in industry at Level 3 Communications and served as the Executive Director for the Internet Innovation Alliance. She was also actively engaged in the policy discussions leading up to the passage of the '96 Telecom Act. So Laura, I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kathryn. And I'm so excited to be here for the inaugural event of this Western Prosperity Roundtable. And just shout out to WGA for recognizing just how important broadband and the digital divide are to prosperity for your communities and for your states. As Kathryn said, I am serve as the Deputy Associate Administrator for our broadband programs at NTIA. And NTIA is a part of the Department of Commerce, where our new secretary, until she joined us, was a governor herself. So has made it really clear to us how important it is that we work with states and understand the important role that they play in addressing the economic vitality of their states and the communities that reside in them. The couple of issues that I'm going to touch on today really center around how do we scope the issue of the digital divide, understanding that it was exacerbated during the pandemic and limited the learning and earning of so many of our residents during that time frame. NTIA has, for the past 3 years, undertaken a mapping project working with states, and frankly, as of today, have 36 states, many of them Western states, who are participating in our mapping program called the National Broadband Availability Map, and working to bring together state resources, look at where industry has provided information, as well as working with census to understand from an individual perspective, right, in collecting data via individual surveys to understand where broadband is and isn't, as well as how people are using it. And then also leveraging third-party data such as speed tests to get a better understanding of scoping the problem that we're trying to fix. And while we don't have all the answers today, we continue to work with our state partners, as well as collaborating with our partners at the FCC, and of course, my colleague, Laurel Leverrier, who's on the panel following, to really better understand where there is infrastructure available and where digital divide issues are more about affordability, or where the divide is driven more by availability of devices. We know that there are a multitude of issues that limit people from accessing what's available to them. But the bottom line is that it's a big issue, and the Department of Commerce is absolutely committed to ensuring that all Americans get access to high-speed, affordable, and reliable services, again, so that they can participate in the digital economy. One thing I'm happy to announce today is that of the 3 grant programs that Congress challenged NTIA to administer in the Consolidated Appropriations Act was released today. And that's making available $288 million for states and political subdivisions to partner with service providers in addressing those key areas that remain unserved in your states. So we look forward to working with you through that grant program. We'll have 2 other grant programs that will make funds available later this summer, including the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program, which is a $1 billion program that's eligible to tribal governments as well as to tribal organizations. And that fund also makes funding available for both deployment of infrastructure as well as for subsidizing costs, as well as for services to support telemedicine, remote learning, and the like. And then finally, the Connecting Minorities Communities pilot program was also authorized and funded under the Consolidated Appropriations Act. And those rules will be coming out later this summer as well and make $285 million available to communities for addressing the digital divide as well. Oh, thank you for pulling up this slide. I think I'm actually on to the next one, and I realize that I can't control that. So this is kind of a high-level overview of those programs that I was talking about. The Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program, the Broadband Infrastructure Deployment Grants, and that's the one that was opened up, and the funding mechanism is available via grants.gov as of earlier today. And then I think I also mentioned the Connecting Minority Communities pilot program, which the rules will be issued later this month. I'm sorry, not later this month, later this summer. So more to come on that. And then I think I also included a brief slide about the importance of coordination. And what I've listed is what was also included in the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which is the requirement for the federal agencies who fund broadband to coordinate in that effort. Laurel can tell you a little bit more about the work that our 2 agencies have done over the years in trying to work within the statutory limitations that we have to ensure that when it's communities or states are looking for funding, that we're coordinating those efforts and trying to work with you to develop holistic approaches to the problems that you're facing. In addition to our coordination with our federal colleagues, NTIA has been very committed to working with states, and through its State Broadband Leaders Network, reaches all 50 states and the 6 territories in order to do that, and works to cross-pollinate between our federal coordination work and our state coordination to ensure that, again, we're leveraging the resources across the federal government as well as with our state colleagues to ensure that we're hearing about what's happening locally and bringing the resources to bear collectively and attempting to address those problems. So thank you again for allowing me to be a part of this inaugural event, and I very much look forward to hearing the questions and engaging with you on how we can be a party to addressing prosperity in your communities. Thank you, and I'm not sure if it's back to you, Kathryn, or over to Laurel.
Back to me briefly, and then over to Laurel. So thank you, Laura. And I'm taking furious notes over here so we can circle back on a couple of those points in the discussion. Next up, we have Laurel Leverrier, who is the Assistant Administrator of USDA's Rural Utilities Service, RUS, the telecommunications programs, where she oversees RUS's $4 billion portfolio of telecom loans and grants. Laurel has been a public servant at USDA for 17 years, and she's served in a variety of positions, as well as participating on several federal working groups, including the American Broadband Initiative. Additionally, Laurel is a recent graduate of American University's Key Executive Leadership Program. So congratulations, Laurel. And now I will turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thanks so much. And we can just go ahead and flip on to the next slide. I've only got one, but it's got a lot of information on it. So we'll go ahead and go there. And if people want to read a little bit while I talk, they can. Hi, everybody. My name's Laurel Leverrier. It's really great to be with you all this afternoon or morning, depending on where you're at. I have the pleasure of serving as the Assistant Administrator of the USDA's Telecommunications programs. And as Kathryn mentioned, I have been in a variety of positions, which gives me the great honor of having worked with a number of the other panelists that you guys have today. And what I think I was reflecting on as we were kind of getting ready this afternoon is what examples and just how much is going on from the federal and state level. You guys just heard from Laura Spinning, and I mean, my gosh, NTIA, so many new initiatives, not to mention all the work that they've been doing on mapping. And so I think it's really exciting seeing all of these different groups and opportunities coming together. This slide represents sort of what I do every day. I oversee our loan and grant programs here at USDA that support telecommunications infrastructure. And so that means most of my day is taken up with, focusing on our loan and grant programs and getting to the nice part of my day is when I get to talk with our clients and the stakeholders and the communities that we serve and hear about what's going on in those communities. Because sometimes, I'll be honest with you, I live in Washington, D.C., and everything that we do is in rural communities, and they have different challenges, some similar, but some different. I've worked in this world for over almost, well, I guess now about 17 years. And, people would talk to me about the need for broadband a decade ago. People understood the importance of broadband 5 years ago. But gosh, this pandemic, if nothing, has showed us how absolutely critical broadband infrastructure is for every part of our life. And, 10 years ago, I talked with economic development people and hospitals. And, again, people saw the need. But I just think the pandemic has heightened for folks what it means for education. If you didn't have a computer at home, your kid didn't go to school, no matter what was happening, for months at a time. And so, I think what has come from a necessity and an important has really just heightened. And I certainly feel that urgency at USDA and I think across the federal family, which is why you see so many different opportunities for funds. So for folks who are involved and interested in it, I do want to take a couple moments to talk about what we're doing at USDA. But before I do that, I do just want to piggyback very quickly on part of what Laura brought up, which is some of the interagency coordination that we have going on. I think in my experience at USDA, I've personally known Laura Spinning and all the folks over at NTIA for over 10 years. But I can tell you that the interagency coordination and communication has really increased. And while we were, I think, before informing each other of what each other was doing and trying to be good colleagues and stewards, what you see now is, I think, much more of a partnership. And I think also a more concerted approach to policy. It doesn't mean the agencies are always going to address issues the same way. At USDA, we, not a surprise, have a rural and an ag focus. That's our mission. And so everything that we do is going to have that perspective and that interest. But I think what is really great, and I think what's really exciting for me as a federal employee, is really seeing these agencies work together to, I think, make our programs hopefully complementary and also supportive of each other's efforts. And similarly with the states, and I think that's, you guys, I think nailed it at the beginning. There's so many states that really are setting the best practices. And so I think that's also really exciting for me. So what do we do at USDA? We oversee a number of programs that support broadband expansion efforts. I think the one that you hear about the most is our Reconnect program. We finished our first 2 rounds of funding and we're gearing up for our 3rd round this fall. So folks that are interested in it, we should have about $1 billion in funds. Our last 2 rounds, we had about $600 million. So this will be substantially more funds available as we go into this 3rd round. We've also added some additional flexibilities to the program that we hope will incentivize folks to be interested in that program. We have our telecom loan program and our rural broadband program. Those have been long-standing programs. If you are interested in a 100% loan, you are an existing service provider, those are great programs for you to go get really low interest rate loans. I thought our loan interest rate was crazy low a long time ago. I mean, rates right now are just insane. So if that's something that can support your community and what you're doing, we have over $600 million in funds available, and it's a non-competitive program. We also have our Community Connect program. It's gotten a lot of support across states. We've also seen a number of communities as well as counties get involved in this program. We closed our window for fiscal 21 back in December. We have $35 million available this year, and I think we won't have a problem using that. But we hope to announce those awards later this summer. And then finally, our distance learning and telemedicine program. It's the one program that we support equipment needed for distance learning and telemedicine. And that program, we have an open application window right now. So excited to join the conversation, and thank you guys so much for having me on the panel.
Thanks, Laurel. It is quite a broad portfolio of work. So thank you very much for explaining all of that and for making the note about equipment. That's not something that we often get to talk very much about in our field. So exciting. Up next, we have Teresa Ferguson, who's the Director of Federal Broadband Engagement for the Colorado Broadband Office, the CBO. Prior to joining the CBO, Teresa worked for the Public Utilities Commissions of Missouri, Washington, and Colorado. She held national leadership positions in each of those entities, engaging with the Federal Communications Commission, USAC, USDA, and organizations such as NARUC, while advocating on behalf of state telecom and broadband policy interests. Teresa also spent 17 years in the private sector deploying broadband networks for schools and libraries in tribal nations funded through the federal E-rate program. This is a long way of saying that if you have any questions about the FCC and E-rate, Teresa is your gal. And Teresa, I will turn it over to you for your presentation.
Oh, thank you so much, Kathryn. I always appreciate your intros. You set me up well. Thank you for inviting me to participate in the WGA's inaugural Western Prosperity Roundtable. Really, I want to share Colorado's long history of recognizing the importance of investing in a statewide broadband infrastructure and the critical role broadband availability plays in supporting a state's ability to have economic resilience, as we've just seen through our experience with COVID. The state of Colorado, by investing in a robust broadband infrastructure, is striving to meet the growing demand for broadband access for public safety, for transportation, for education, for healthcare, for all Coloradans. And so on my next slide, I'd like to share some of Colorado's highlights of our broadband journey. Because I want you to understand, as Kathryn was talking about earlier, states have been doing a lot. And so I've only got one slide like Laurel does, but I've got to cover a lot of ground here to try to give you our toolkit for how we feel like we've gotten to where we are today with the successes that Colorado has experienced. In 2009, like many other states, we received a $2 million ERA grant to map broadband availability in Colorado. Our office has continued since then to update broadband availability mapping twice a year. That information is provided by internet service providers on a voluntary program. And so some of the data is imprecise, making it a challenge to identify where broadband is and isn't across the state. With well over a decade of experience, though, in working with the industry to redefine our data collection efforts, and by leveraging publicly available GIS data, the CBO has created a broadband map, the Colorado Broadband Map, which is the data set that is used by Colorado policymakers to guide broadband policy and funding. The map's also available to the public to allow them to identify users in their area and the available service that the ISPs identify by location that they provide. In 2020, I was thrilled to actually join the NTIA's National Broadband Availability Mapping Initiative. And so Colorado is very much involved in that process and providing all of the robust, over a decade of data that we've collected in our state about where broadband is and isn't in Colorado. Now, what we think is one of our key weapons against, or in favor of providing broadband throughout the state is a unique program that Colorado has that funds broadband deployment for middle mile. Since 2013, the Department of Local Affairs has funded over $40 million in strategic planning and infrastructure grants. DOLA has committed going forward as well to provide $5 million a year through 2023 to support local government deployment of middle mile infrastructure. And I know you guys understand that lower cost middle mile leads to lower cost last mile. So we really feel like this middle mile program is essential to our success in reaching all Coloradans and providing cost-effective broadband. The CBO was informally established in 2016 and given the responsibility of coordinating the state's broadband policies across all state agencies to look at broadband infrastructure investments in a holistic way and to enable the development of a statewide communications infrastructure to meet our growing demand. And through the package of bills that was passed in 2014, Last Mile Broadband Grant Program was established for Colorado and placed in the Department of Regulatory Affairs. And the Broadband Deployment Board was created. That Last Mile Grant Program is funded through repurposed high-cost funds that were previously collected to support universal service voice for Colorado. But since 2016, the Broadband Deployment Board has committed over $41 million in last mile broadband grants, funding 51 projects benefiting over 25,000, oh my gosh, I did stumble on that one, 25,000 homes, farms, and ranches. Now, I want to make a particular note that over 70% of those grants are funding projects that are capable of delivering gigabit fiber to the home. And we've made a lot of strides since 2016 in funding broadband connectivity for rural households, but we knew it wasn't going to be enough because states simply don't have the financial resources to shoulder the cost of closing the broadband infrastructure gap. So in early 2019, the CBO expanded its program to focus on securing Colorado's fair share of federal broadband funding. With billions of federal grants and loans available, being awarded on an annual basis, CBO knew that the state needed to encourage Colorado stakeholders to apply for federal broadband funding. And since the initiation of that program, Colorado ISPs have been awarded over $15 million in federal grants funds, which will result in over $20 million total project cost investment with the matches they're required to provide. So over 1,300 homes, farms, and ranches in Dolores, Moffett, South Routt, and Eagle counties. These are all coal-impacted communities that are really looking for a way to retool their communities, their economies, and lay the foundation for economic reliance and growth. In early 2020, the governor's office asked the CBO to convene a broadband working group with key participants from across Colorado state agencies. Now, little did we know that we were going to be embarking on this work at the onset of a pandemic. And knowing that Coloradans' resilience on access to affordable and reliable high-speed broadband was going to be even more critical to our state's economy, to be able to remote work, to e-learn, and to access telemedicine needs. But we knuckled down, we got the work done. In October of 2020, Governor Polis released the Broadband Initiatives report, which outlines the state's vision to create economic opportunity for Coloradans through changing how Colorado governs, maps, funds, and deploys broadband. The governor also signed an executive order creating a broadband advisory board within the Office of Information Technology to focus on collaboration and coordination of broadband efforts for Colorado, and partnering with the Office of Future Work for the development of the state's digital inclusion and literacy policies. So I want to take a moment to take a breath because I want to sort of set the stage for you as well. We can't really overlook this. All of this has been done in a state that had a broadband municipal ban that was passed in Colorado in 2005, which precluded municipal broadband deployment. Each of these communities, though, 140 of them, have each gone to the ballot and received authority from their voters to deploy broadband, municipal broadband throughout their communities. Longmont, Fort Collins, and Loveland are deploying fiber to the home, providing affordable 100 megabit and gigabit service to their communities. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Colorado is the envy of many states due to the increasing broadband deployment activity of our rural electric cooperatives and their broadband subsidiaries. 5 of Colorado's 22 electric co-ops have deployed or are deploying fiber to the home to their members in Northwest, Southwest, South Central, and Southeast Colorado. I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion because I know and respect so many of these panelists, and I'm excited about where the conversation will take us. Thanks, Kathryn.
Thanks, Teresa. And if anybody is curious about Colorado's program, it's one of the programs that my team has profiled in their research. So if you want some analyses of why we think Colorado is doing some things right, please go to our website. So next up, we have Kimball Sekaquaptewa, who is the Chief Technology Officer, Chief Technology Director for the Santa Fe Indian School and a member of the Hopi tribe. Kimball brings decades of experience of working to bring connectivity to tribal schools and libraries. Now I'm the one tripping over everything, Teresa. Is it like catching through the internet? So Kimball brings decades of experience of increasing connectivity to tribal schools and libraries, and has been a very fierce advocate for getting students connected during the pandemic for remote learning. You may have seen her on Good Morning America and in the New York Times, but I'm very excited to turn the mic over to her so we can hear about the efforts that she's been leading. So Kimball, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here today among all these esteemed women, broadband advocates. That's an awesome feeling. I am coming today from Santa Fe, New Mexico. I work at the Santa Fe Indian School, and we are a K-12 school that is owned and operated by the 19 tribes. And with that tribal control, we're have a close relationship with the 19 pueblos and those governors, and really constantly, ask them what their priorities are. What are the needs in community? What are the skills do the students need to come back to develop capacity? And that's been our school for, over 30 years that we've been tribally controlled. We are an off-reservation boarding school. So we have 2/3 of our students dorm 5 days a week, and then we ask that they go home to maintain their community connections and participation. But we also bring in 6 bus lines, 3 from the south and 3 from the north every day. So for us, when we closed for COVID, you can go to the next slide. We sent our kids to 22 rural tribal lands. So when we were solving for connectivity to improve remote learning, we had to look at each one of those situations and figure out a best solution for them. And it was eye-opening. I mean, others have spoken. There's no doubt about it that we knew the digital divide existed. I mean, at that time, we were working with the FCC data that 41% of tribal people lacked broadband access, and then that jumped to 68 rural. So we were aware of the situation, and we've been working actively on it since the ERA days and the BTOP opportunities. And at that time, personally, for me, we were trying to get high-speed internet, a fiber-based solution in the capital of New Mexico, and it was unavailable. And although our consortium application during that time, which included Santa Fe Community College, City of Santa Fe County, and the Institute of American Indian Arts, that's a coalition that had never done anything together. And that was profound. And that really taught me, all these years later, how we have to work together. Unfortunately, that application was less than 1 minute late in BTOP. And but we have some lasting partnerships out of it. So, fast forward back to COVID, when we sent everybody home, it became very aware, as others have mentioned, that it really wasn't a divide. It was a digital chasm. The penalties for being on the wrong side of it were so deep and profound, and went down to health and literally almost life and death situation in our communities. And in New Mexico, as with many other tribal lands, we were disproportionately affected. So we're almost 11% of the state population, and we represented over 50% of the cases at one point, and our mortality was also the highest of any group in New Mexico. So as a school, we can't have 6 bus lines and a dorm program coming together every day. So we knew that everybody had to stay home and to protect our communities. And then our governors actually put physical roadblocks at our borders to keep people from going in and people from going out. So the students that were going to McDonald's in town for internet connectivity or coming from school, they completely lost access. And where they would go before that was like the tribal libraries. They get off the bus and go to the libraries. And once we needed to close those for COVID, then they were just what they had in their homes. And when we polled them, we found out that 44% of our kids did not have any home internet once you took out the cell phones. And that's at 10-1. And I'm almost scared to tell you that that's pretty close to double if you want to go to 25-3 for underconnected. And in our largest community, which is actually in between Santa Fe and Albuquerque, which is 50 miles, that's not the most rural description, 0 homes, 0%, 0 kids had connectivity. And that community, no cellular providers, there was no cell service, there was 0 bars. So to solve that one, I worked with Verizon actually, and they had a disaster recovery unit and we were able to deploy it, and they worked and left it there through this whole time. And we appreciate that partnership, but that was an important intervention, but that's not a permanent solution. And even where the hotspots were given out in each community, there's always dead zones in each one. But just so I can speed up a little bit, I just wanted to share some of the results from the first survey we administered in the fall. Now we've come back since then because we're better at surveying, and we actually are putting in speed tests. And we're using Find Me GIS technologies to capture a lat long of the student and where they're connecting from. Because when we try to match a student to an internet solution and we're getting a PO box, you can't do it. And that's been a challenge that's been in New Mexico because I work closely with the state initiatives. So when we realized that how little internet we had to figure out what we were going to do. We at Santa Fe Indian School asked our students how they were connecting, and that among parents and students, we discovered extremely high rate of prepaid internet plans. So that's when the family had extra cash, disposable income to buy a prepaid plan, then they'd have it for a couple months and then it would go away and their phone numbers would change. They were using public locations, and I already mentioned the tribal library or people's houses. So they were nomadic, but they're crafty. They found a way to do what they needed to do. But for remote learning, what we said was, how are they going to connect reliably? At the very beginning of COVID, it took a while for Verizon and T-Mobile to come down with those COVID plans, and $39.99 a month was too much for our kids. So we resisted, but we worked with them until they came out with more reasonable plans, and we eventually bought them really nice Chromebooks. And that's another lesson coming out of the education community, is that when we all scrambled to buy the cheapest Chromebooks out there, we kind of chopped ourselves off at the knees because the video quality wasn't as good as we wanted it to be for the remote and synchronous learning classes. So we did do that right. And then we got LTE embedded, LTE capable Chromebooks, so that wherever the best provider was, we matched it. And that's how we got through COVID. But if you could go to the next slide, please. The last thing we did is we worked with, as a middle gap, stopgap, was we worked with nonprofits in our area and the ITDRC, who came in nationally and installed hundreds of hotspots all over our tribal areas for that public Wi-Fi. But of course, as you know, you realize that going and sitting outside next to a hot bus all day just results in heat stroke, as we saw, with some of our little guys trying to do their best. But where we are now focusing, and where we had this momentum already developing in New Mexico, was that we've been working on broadband since, me personally, but others since that BTOP era. So when we came into, there was one regional network that's owned by some municipalities, counties, and 4 pueblos up north. Then we saw how you could put in hundreds of miles of middle mile infrastructure. And then once E-rate modernized in 2014, I believe, we looked back and said, okay, I have been using E-rate Santa Fe Indian School since year one of the program. So it's great that you can get a 90% discount, but if you only can get a 90% discount off of the slow T1, you know, you're not in a much different situation than you would be if you didn't use E-rate. But when E-rate modernized and allowed for fiber optic installation, then we looked at it, and I remember that day. It was just myself and 2 tribal librarians from 2 very small communities reading the rules and saying, wait, we think we can. Wait, is this right? Is this a possibility for us? And we decided to go for it. So we put out that E-rate RFP, and after several months and iterations, because we realized we needed to aggregate our demand and work with all of our neighbors down the whole line of where that route would go, we came back with a 4-tribe coalition and then a sister application with 2, and we were able to build 2 60-mile fiber optic networks leveraging E-rate. But that's only schools and libraries, right? If you're going to go through all that effort, how do you not connect government? How do you not connect health? How do you not connect environmental departments? So we went back to our tribal councils and our governors and explained this, and then they self-invested in a parallel network, so we were able to provide that holistic solution. But what we did with that is we kind of cracked the code, and you'll see some plows here of the fiber build, and I believe this is on Santo Domingo Pueblo, where we kind of demystified the internet. You know, it's not this sparkly, dazzly thing with it, you know, with that looks like an orb that glows and is just mysterious and fantastic. It is digging and putting plastic pipes in the ground with a plow. Once we figured that out, we're like, okay, this is a project. It's a big project, but we can do this one step at a time. And we were a motley group. We had, I said we were grassroots. So it was myself, an education with E-rate experience, tribal librarians, tribal administrators, and then we would sponge off of everybody's attorneys and, you know, whoever we need. And we get to a point and we'd say, well, who knows about the right of way? And somebody would raise their hand and we'd tap into that knowledge. So by pulling together this collective expertise, we were able to build out these networks. So I'm happy to say that 11 of the 19 pueblos have solved this fiber issue for the middle mile, and we continue to build. And that's something that I'm very much looking forward to in the grant applications that were just described to you in the next year. And then what COVID forced us to do was to do the last mile to address the homes. And we knew we wanted to get to homes, and we were starting to talk about it. We talked to play out, maybe reconnect, maybe not. And then COVID hit, and then we shut down. So, but the tribes that had the backhaul solved with the middle mile in were able to pivot very quickly and deploy residential wireless networks. And we saw Jemez Pueblo, maybe 500 homes, using some of the CARES money and some state funding, you know, came up in the fall, and now they're 100% deployed and in service. And you're talking, you know, a price tag of hundreds of thousands, not hundreds of thousands plus 4 million to build out the middle mile infrastructure. So we're going to see at least 10 of 19 pueblos moving forward this year with networks. And for those of you guys who might not know, all tribes nationally had a first time ever opportunity to access spectrum. So unlike our natural resources like water, where we have sovereign control over our lands, we do not have sovereign control over our airways. So the spectrum for, you know, license frequencies, you know, runs through the FCC. And when there's a opportunity for an auction, we don't have any priority, but we were given a priority in this one time. And that is really cool because now 400 tribes applied for it. So in all these Western lands where large swaths of the spectrum was available, you have tribes who are ready to set up and utilize this infrastructure. And that's a real opportunity for the states to work with. So thank you very much. And I'll conclude my introduction.
Thanks, Kimball. You just hit on a lot of really great points in a short amount of time. So we're going to come back to several of them, but thank you. So we have, last but not least, Susan Anable, who is who's the Vice President of Public and Government Affairs for Cox in its Southeast region, which covers both Arizona and Nevada. Cox, for those of you who aren't aware, is a family-owned private company that provides broadband, phone, cable, and home automation, residential and business services in 18 states across the country. Susan has been with Cox for 20 years and has worked extensively with local, state, and federal officials and agencies on broadband deployment issues. So Susan, thanks so much for joining us, and jump in.
Thank you, Kathryn. Appreciate the introduction. I'm so delighted to be here today and representing Cox Communications and also the cable broadband industry at large. And I hope my comments and remarks today will reflect, I think, broadly what the private sector is doing to try to address these very critical issues that we're discussing today about broadband access. And I really want to focus my conversation today around sort of two key critical issues as we look at it from a private sector standpoint. One is how important network investment is. And if we had not learned that before this past year, we really experienced it this past year during COVID, that future-proofing and disaster-proofing your network is critical, and it is ongoing, and it is expensive. And so I want to talk a little bit about that today, but I also want to talk about the critical role that the private sector plays in partnering with governments and nonprofits to help bridge the digital divide. And I want to talk a little bit about what Cox Communication is doing specifically to address that issue. If you could take us to the next slide, please. So I mentioned investment, investing in the network and making sure that it is functioning adequately to meet the needs of our customers. And during a global pandemic, we have never seen such demand on our network. As was discussed by previous speakers today, as people went home to work, to learn, to receive healthcare, the demand we saw shift from our business sector to our residential sector was quite epic, to say the least. And the investment we made in our network over the last 10 years really paid off. We put $15 billion into our network over the last 10 years. We're putting another $10 billion in over the next 5. And that is to continue to add capacity, add bandwidth, to reinforce our network and to make sure that it is resilient enough to meet the demands of our communities. And I know one of the issues that you all are interested in with this particular forum is understanding the economic impacts. What are the impacts that broadband has? And we know that when people start returning to work, it's not going to look like it did before the pandemic. We know we're expecting that there'll be hybrid workplace models where you might have people working part of their day from home or an entire week from home, maybe being only in the office one day a week. So all that said, we know the demands on the network will continue to be both residential and both business. And we will continue our efforts to look out in advance, future-proof the network, and make sure we're anticipating and meeting the needs of our customers going forward. I'm also pleased to tell you that during the pandemic, our network held up really well. And indeed, the networks of virtually all of our broadband providers in the cable industry held up very well in spite of all of the demands. If you go ahead and take us to the next slide, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the other aspect, and that is bridging the digital divide. In all the conversations about how do we make sure that everyone has access to the internet, we know that as a largely urban internet service provider, there are families, there are individuals that sit within urban areas with fiber at their front door that don't have access to the internet. And there's many reasons for that. Affordability is a huge one. There are also cultural gaps. There are also digital literacy issues. There are device issues, as has been talked about today. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the program that Cox has been invested in and supporting for more than 10 years, and that's Connect to Compete. This program was originally envisioned to be a way to connect low-income families with kids who are in the K-12 education system to make sure that those kids have access to the internet so they can do homework at home at night, so that they can have their parents have a communication with their teachers to be able to do the research that they need. But we also acknowledge there's residual benefit to the family unit inside that home who can look for jobs, who can advance their own education. But really it was intended to connect those families and those those kids to their teachers and to their schools. Well, flash forward to the last year, and all of a sudden that household now had 3 kids on Zoom meetings all day long for their education. Wasn't really what Connect to Compete was intended for. So we did a lot of modification of the program this last year to make sure we were meeting the expectations and the needs of our students. For example, in the last year, we've added over 60,000 new families to the Connect to Compete program across our footprint. It's a $9.95 per month product, and we also increased our speed from 25 megabits per second to 50 download speed. And I'm very pleased to report that officially last week, we have announced we are going to make that a permanent speed increase for our C2C families. They will continue to get 50 past the existing school year. We also give those families a free Wi-Fi modem rental. We give them access to our hotspots in our communities. We give them access to our Digital Academy, which is a curriculum-based program for kids as well. And there is no credit check for these families to join the program. So this is something that we know is key to making sure that families continue to stay connected. Cox is also participating in the emergency broadband program as well, and we are making sure that our C2C families were pre-qualified to be able to participate in that in the program as well. So again, the digital divide is something that is as important in our urban communities as it is in our rural communities in our Western states. And it's something that we want to continue as an industry and certainly as a priority of Cox Communications to invest in that. If you could take us to the next slide, please. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about some of the unique public-private partnership success stories we've experienced the last year or so, and specifically in some of our Western states. For example, in Clark County School District in Southern Nevada, the school district partnered with Cox and another local nonprofit organization to provide Connect to Compete services to their families with kids in the K through 12 school district during the COVID pandemic. And in doing so, we were able to connect 5,500 homes. The school district chose to use their CARES Act dollars to help pay for those services for those families. In 6 weeks, we were able to get 15,000 students in that school district connected to the internet and able to learn from home. We had similar success stories with other school districts across our footprint here in Arizona, in Tucson, in Amphi School District. We partnered with their foundation, able to connect families there, able to partner to get devices to those students. And then likewise in California and in Oklahoma, we were able to do similar partnerships. I will also call out that not just school districts, but municipalities were wonderful partners working with us as well. We were able to put together bulk programs and opportunities. So if a city like the city of Tulsa wanted to connect low-income households with the internet, we could set up a bulk account and provide a low-cost internet service connection to people that may not have even been eligible for our Connect to Compete product. So I think it's important to note that the public-private partnerships have enabled us to very quickly deploy internet service to make sure people stay connected for learning, for working from home, for healthcare needs, because as I mentioned earlier, in many cases, there literally is fiber at the front door for many of our folks who are in the urban markets. And there's ways that we can get creative and we can work together with municipalities, with school districts, with nonprofits to try to make sure we enable those connections. If you can take me to the next slide and I'll wrap up my remarks. I want to address just a couple of things that I think might be things to consider for all of us and all of you who are with us today on this panel, that might be things we can focus on to continue to bridge the digital divide and get better deployment of broadband to our rural communities. One, removing some of the broad barriers to network construction and deployment. The agency coordination that's been discussed today, super important, making sure permitting gets expedited, and the process for accessing the right-of-way is really important as well. I'd give a shout out to my own state here in Arizona. The state of Arizona, with the leadership of Governor Ducey, was able to provide some relief and some expedited access to key right-of-way along our state interstate system for both the private sector and public partners that want to deploy fiber into parts of the state where we know we need to do a better job of connecting our rural communities. That's going to be huge. We can get into conduit into places that we might not have been able to afford to get to before, as we were discussing the middle mile challenges. Secondly, I think encouraging partnerships. When we can bring together private sector companies like Cox and other cable providers to work with municipalities and to work with nonprofits, we can do so much more. We've got the experiences, a private industry where we're already working in the right of way. We're constructing and maintaining networks. We want to be able to do a better job of partnering to see if we can utilize some of these opportunities that are before us with the federal broadband grants that are coming to the states and local jurisdictions to extend network to make sure that we are meeting the needs of our communities. And then third, I want to make sure that in understanding what are the barriers to adoption, we talked earlier about affordability. That is a key one for sure. But there's also access to buildings. MDUs are an area where we often run into problems where a building owner in an apartment complex or a trailer park won't allow access to a provider. That's a big issue for us. Lack of devices for the customer, the cultural barriers and the digital literacy gaps that we discussed as well. So, building more networks don't solve for those problems except for perhaps affordability, but partnerships can solve for some of those challenges as well. And then lastly, I'd just note that having tech neutral solutions is really important. There's a lot of innovation going on in this space. There's a lot of creative minds out there coming up with solutions to get to places that terrestrial fiber may be cost prohibitive and literally prohibitive from geological and geographic limitations. And we need to continue to invest in and look at ways to innovate to bring services to areas that have not been able to get the services through, again, terrestrial fiber. And with that, I'll end my remarks, and thank you so much again for being part of this panel, and look forward to the Q&A section.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. So we have about 15 minutes left, 15 to 20 minutes. So we are going to jump in to a couple of these questions. And again, to the audience, if y'all have additional questions, please enter them in the Q&A. Everybody has touched on the role of coordination, the importance of coordination, and how coordination and why coordination has been so essential, particularly in recent years. So I think the first question I'm going to direct at Kimball is one thing that's come up in our research, in particular in Western states, is how to improve coordination between state and tribal entities. So as all of this federal funding is getting ready to come down, we could have an entire panel just breaking all these options down just from the American Rescue Plan alone. But as states are thinking about implementing these funds and implementing their own funds, how should they be thinking about coordinating with tribal entities?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think most of my insight is just through, experience. We have the state broadband offices that are standing up. And when we were doing the state E-rate project, our tribal schools weren't even eligible. So I kind of got to come to the meetings and sit on the corner and kind of be involved, and wasn't eligible for the money, but but watched and saw how the state agencies operated together when they came together even. So I think I had education on my side then to take back to my tribal entities. But I think for states wanting to work with tribes, the first thing is the relationship building. I know that comes up. But what does that mean? Like, go to the tribe, don't email, like set up the in-person meeting and go and see it and see what they're talking about and their challenges. So you can have that in your mind when you come back and you're talking about partnerships. And then when you come back and you kind of been thinking about it, say, what can I offer? Can I offer some technical assistance through a program? Do I have subject matter experts with right of way that maybe they might have questions and I want to connect with them, and and start doing that partnership work. And then an exciting partnership that's evolving for me this year in New Mexico is with the New Mexico Department of Transportation. I'm going to do a 30-mile build coming down from Santa Fe. They're opening up a very tricky, rocky area called La Bajada. So when they're opening the ground and they did in the engineering, why don't they put my conduit in? Because a mile later, that when I'm going to open it up on tribal land, I'll put in their conduit for their communication systems. So identify those mutually beneficial relationships and then do the legal work and the agreements to execute them. Another area would be once we start talking about the telehealth and the remote learning and the digital inclusion, and they're coalescing around an interest group, have the tribal interest group be part of those conversations. That would be my recommendation.
Thank you.
Sure.
So Laurel and Laura, would you mind touching on this, on federal interagency coordination? And Kimball, if you have anything to add on that regard as well, would appreciate your perspective. But Laura and Laurel, can you talk about how your agencies have thought about trying to streamline this coordination, not only between USDA and NTIA, but other agencies across the federal government, and what the result has been?
So Laurel, I'll start, and then I think you mentioned it quite a bit in your comments, and it's, I think that Laurel talked about it as, 10 years ago when she and I first started working together. We did quite a bit to just kind of go through the motions and be sure that we were communicating back and forth. And now we're at a place where we're sharing a mapping platform, so that as each agency gets better information, better data, that we're sharing that across a platform. And that's a real big step in the right direction. We know there's more to go, and know that investing in the front end, when Congress allocates funding, that there's a lot more work to do. And both of our agencies have agreed to participate in that, but know that it's going to be a big challenge, and that it's not going to be as simple as, just filling in what you've done on a spreadsheet, or even in a mapping platform. So I don't know exactly what that looks like. What I'm pleased to say is that between our agencies, there's a real commitment to rolling up our sleeves and trying to work through that. And we think that there are some best practices from a number of states who have faced these issues. And as Teresa talked about, looking at the mapping effort that they've undertaken, and because the landscape is always changing, right? It's never you get it done and move on, but it's really about, on an ongoing basis, keeping that line of communication open, and then finding tools and resources that we can leverage together. Laurel?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Laura, I think you nailed it. The only thing I would just add is that I am personally very appreciative of the great work NTIA has done on the National Broadband Availability Map. And of course, a lot of that is a result of a lot of the folks and different states that are involved in that, right? That map is only as good as the data that's being fed into it. But what I'm really ecstatic about is that not only are we sharing data, but my agency's use of the National Broadband Availability Map, which we are integrating into our review process, will be, kind of some of the first times when we're actually even, and then using that to base decisions, right? And that's really helpful because it, for me, is a huge area that we have to address. It's something that my agency spends a lot of time and effort on, is going out and validating where there is and is not service, so that we're making sure we're making investments in areas that don't have it. But I think that's also a really great output, where you can see tangibly where those efforts are coming to play, and we're now actually being able to use that in the decision-making process, which is a huge step forward from just kind of communicating about, hey, here's what I'm doing, which is great. And it's really awesome, I think, thinking about some of the states that have participated, and I think specifically like Teresa in Colorado, you guys spent a lot of time on mapping. And that was part of the decision-making process then to help drive some of the decision-making process later. So I think that's all really something we're looking at and really focused on right now.
Yeah, actually, Teresa, can you pick up on that point a little bit? Just speaking about the, I think the coordination both up with the feds, with tribal entities, with localities, and maybe also grounding that a little bit to, data collaboration on data and information sharing is great, but there are also some of the practical realities of deployment, like permitting. So thinking through that, when you've got multiple agencies that are participating in things like reviewing permitting, getting funding out the door, like how do you think about that when you're working with state agencies and localities and tribes?
Thanks, Kathryn. Perfect tee up. Kimball, I want to say I understand the struggles that you're going through. We are, in the state of Colorado, we have a little bit more resources than most state broadband offices have. And so we have a person that is a point of contact for our tribal nations, the Ute, Mountain Ute, and the Southern Ute in our state. And we work those relationships on a weekly basis. We have been working with them for over 2 years, 2.5, 3 years, just with this iteration of the CBO, and working through the Lieutenant Governor's office to make sure as our tribal nations were seeking that 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, we were supporting them, providing them information, and not writing grants for them, because obviously they have got resources to be able to do that. But you've got to be, bird dogging all these federal programs and saying, hey, are you looking at this one? Or have you thought about this one? Or how can we make those work together with our state programs, right? So Kathryn, you're perfect. You're right on target. It's if you have the resources, can you support those communities, the local communities? Going upwards, Laurel and I have worked together for probably the last couple of years on Reconnect, because I hit the door in 2019 and Reconnect started. We are so aggressively leaning in on this program and the opportunities that it provides to our state. We're running into some things that have surprised us, right? The program's awesome, but just like at the state of Colorado, we've got interagency, multiple agencies that touch broadband, right? And so Western states are kind of unique. We've got things like national parks and public lands. And so we deal with, Bureau of Land Management and their permitting, requirements for cultural and environmental surveys. And they're surprising us with some of the costs associated with getting through those easement perfection and access to. So we're working together. We're trying to, iron out the bumps, but there are issues that we're still facing because Western states are a little different in private land versus public land. And so I'm trying to be as straightforward as I can be on those things and still recognize that there's a great amount of support that we get from our federal partners as well. But, broadband's door to door, it's block to block. And I think overall, not just these federal programs, but with the FCC as well, we need more honest and frank conversations about how these programs affect our communities, because we're the ones here on the block that are dealing with the concerns of the communities, whether it's the level of bandwidth or it's permitting. It's a very broad spectrum of issues that we're facing.
Yes, and go ahead, Kimball.
Well, I just want to say that I really appreciate NTAI's leadership, especially in this last round of the relief planning, because the tribal engagement, the public comment periods, it's almost a quarter-time job just to make sure you get in and listen and participate, because I feel like they're listening. And I feel like the collaboration across the agencies is so important. And one of the problems with the tribes is the reporting with data has been really inaccurate, under-reporting us, how many houses we have, over-reporting how many people have access to high-speed internet if one person in the census tract, has connectivity. So the alternative measures where communities, tribes, but I would hope this would apply to other, rural communities, can also have their definitions and their own criteria that is considered in these mapping efforts, because then those maps are the ones that the programs refer to. And when we look up our lands and we find out we're eligible or not eligible based on this information, it's going to go our way or it's not going to go our way. And then just real quick on the, working near and with tribal lands and permitting or right of way, a tribe may want to work with you, but in certain conditions, you might have to get a Bureau of Indian Affairs right of way. And that's adds 18 months right there, 2 years, depending on the situation. So there's some practical aspects to planning. And if you work with the tribe and go in before your project, before the FCC gives a subsidy to a provider, and ask the tribe if they want service from that provider, then the tribe's going to help that service provider get the right of ways and go through those processes and speed up their internal processes. Because otherwise what we see happens is a company has, let's just say 10 years to build out, let's just say 90% of their network. If you start that tribal engagement at that last year in the final months, there's no way you can be successful. And the tribes end up in that 10% perpetually underconnected, and it rolls on to a new 10 years and a new provider. And we and our neighbors, our non-tribal neighbors right around our boundaries also could become collateral damage to that system.
I think, Kimball, I appreciate you bringing that up. And, you know, it's true in working with tribal entities, but just in general, the sooner you start planning, the better off your project will be. And the more that you can do that community engagement, that partner engagement, it really will pay off in dividends. For the long-term success of these projects, whether they're funded by state dollars, federal dollars, or, you know, other sources, private, whatever. But that was, I think, even for a team of people who specialize in this issue, in our research, the role of planning, this relatively low, comparatively low cost investment in planning, capacity building, community building, really does pay off. So just unsolicited recommendation to the folks on the phone. But thank you, Kimball, for bringing that up. We have just a few minutes left. So what I'd like to do is ask each one of you, there's a lot of money coming forward from federal sources and from states as well. So as we think about making meaningful steps forward, you know, what are your top 2 recommendations for what leaders should be thinking about? Now, for Susan, I'm going to pose this question to you for urban communities and densely populated communities, but for the rest of the group, if you could target that at rural and remote, low density communities, and what those leaders should be thinking about as federal funds come available, that would be great. So Susan, you first.
Great. And again, a little bit of a reiteration of what I shared earlier. Talk to your local broadband providers for solutions before trying to figure it out on your own. I think that you will find there is a lot of opportunity there. I think that's critically important for success and for making the dollars go farther to serve more people. So I think that's critical. I also think it's important. I know some of the programs historically where federal grants have been made available and some state grants as well, it has precluded a private sector partner because the private sector partner can't own the network that's funded with the grant dollars. That's been a big limitation in the past. So I think that's something that we ought to consider and look at as well in terms of coming up with partner solutions that would enable a company like mine to expand our current service area into urban and rural fringe areas that may not be getting served today. So those would be my 2 recommendations.
Thank you. No, that's really helpful. And I think the discussion about the structure of grants and how money is awarded is also like that's like a whole conference unto itself, and just the differences in states and all those considerations that we often just don't think about when we work at the national level. So, all right, Teresa, over to you. Rural communities, what should they think about?
I think we have to look at local engagement and identifying, as Kimball brought up, if it's the tribal community or if it's still a local community. It doesn't matter. You need that engagement from that local level to come up with solutions that fit for that community. And the 2 things that I think really we need to be thinking about as we're looking at moving forward is a usable standard for broadband. I mean, we've lived through 12 months now of students struggling with a standard that can't support a multi-student household. And so we really have to focus on how we identify what is a usable standard that we should try to get everyone to be able to access the internet for e-learning, telemedicine, and remote work. And I think we need to look at grant recipients being able to provide an income qualified tier of service when they are providing service and receiving these grants at a state or federal level, that hits those two things of affordability and accessibility. So I know I hit three things there, but you gave me a moment, so thank you.
That's okay. I'm not going to yank the mic out of you. All right, Laurel, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think just repeating some of what the other panel members have already mentioned, but, you know, I do think that at this point, pre-planning, you know, whether it's going ahead and starting that permitting process or it's thinking through what your project could be. I mean, from my perspective, I just can't, I mean, I'm acting like I'm 90 years old. I'm not 90 years old, but you know, I mean, there's a lot of money and there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of focus, you know, and not just interest in, hey, let's shovel money at this. You know, you have local community leaders who are saying this is important. I'm willing to look at my permitting issues. I'm willing to make that phone call to that guy to make sure we can get you that timeline. I mean, there are so many different folks that see this as a critical issue. And so that sort of gets to my second piece, which is partnerships. I mean, I really, the communities that don't have service today, there's issues, whether it's remoteness or economic challenges, whatever, that there's not already a service provider there. And leveraging the partnerships that's there from the states to the economic development folks. I mean, what I've seen is that everybody's willing to be part of a solution. I just think sometimes people don't know how they're individually the solution. But when we pull together, you know, I think that's when we're going to address these issues. So those are the things I would encourage communities to be looking at: planning for today and establishing partnerships that you can leverage as you can move forward.
Very good advice. Laura.
All right, thanks, Kathryn. I think the two things that jump to mind for me, and I'll build a little bit on what Susan said, but that is understand what assets are there locally to begin with. And that part of that is understanding who the providers are that are there, understanding what data exists. You know, there's not perfect data, but understanding what is there and how to leverage and build on what exists today. Because for the most part, you're not starting with a greenfield, right? There's something there. There are some assets that either the community owns, that the state or county owns, and then there are existing providers of some service, whether it is your electric co-op, the telephone company that's been there for years, the cable company, and build on what exists and partner with the resources that you've got to make them better. I'd say one thing that I've noticed as a trend over the past 5 years that's been really encouraging is that when you had conversations with either local elected officials or local civil servants 5 years ago, it seemed like the discussion was more about complaining about, oh my gosh, I'm getting all these calls from my constituents about how they don't have adequate service, or it's too expensive, or all they've got is satellite. And that conversation has really dramatically changed to be more about understanding what the issues are and understanding, this is my point number 2, is understand where you want to go. And that comes back to, this is going to reveal just how old I am. Speaking of Laurel Leverrier, I still rely on, you know, my 7 habits of highly effective people, and begin with the end in mind. So think about where you want to be in the out years and plan for that. Don't plan to solve today's problem. Plan for where you want to be in 10 years and be aggressive in thinking about where you want to go and leveraging the assets that you have, whether they're partnership with providers, whether they're vertical rights of way that you own or buildings that you own, and leverage those for your future vision. So those would be my 2.
This is great. Federal perspective. Okay, from USDA and NTIA. Okay, Kimball, no pressure. What's your final take?
I don't know if I can match that, what has gone ahead of me. But I will say, to Laura's point, I didn't understand the value and the potential of vertical assets, whether it's a tower you own or a water tank you have, such a tremendous tool you have in your arsenal. And then speaking to that my fiber engineer sitting across the way right there tells me that all the time. Plan with the end in mind. If you tell me where you want to go, I can tell you how we can do it. And then if I know it's 50 miles, we look at the landowners along the way. That tells you who you got a permit. You know, it's just that it's a pragmatic, practical approach. But the second thing that I would say is just observing what's coming down is the workforce training. Actually, I've three. I'm going to sneak in another one. Once we built these networks, both the fiber one and the wireless ones, we're now operating, or owners and operators. So who's going to own and operate it? Is it going to be our tribal members who are going to live on our community, stay close to home, and have good high-paying jobs? Not if we don't train them and build that workforce. So I have 6 tribes that we are purely going through a workforce training cohort for both management and technical skills. So once you're thinking about infrastructure, right behind that needs to be like the human capital to make these programs sustainable and successful. And then I'm really excited. My third one would be that digital inclusion is becoming, and digital equity is getting the awareness it deserves for having devices and having training for people to know how to use their devices. And it seems to be eligible in just about all these federal programs that are coming on board. So while I might do a middle mile application, I want to have a digital inclusion program ready to insert into my applications. That might be a different set of people from your infrastructure people that are working on that part, but get that team together and get that ball rolling and get that included in the applications.
I think that is great, and a great place for us to wrap. I will also add that we are seeing more states ask and include those elements of digital inclusion in their applications. So hopefully we'll see more Western states joining that too. Thank you everybody, panelists, for joining us today. I think if we can have 3 takeaways from this conversation, it's planning, coordination, communication. So if you were looking for the silver bullet, you're welcome. I just gave you 3. But thank you again to the Western Governors Association for having this discussion today, and we hope that it was helpful for all of you. Have a good afternoon.
Yes, thank you, Kathryn, and thanks to all of our great panelists and the audience who tuned in. We will be taking a short break, and we'll be back at 3:15 p.m. Mountain Time for the next panel, which will be education and training for a rapidly changing economy. So thank you again for your great work, and we'll see you in a few minutes here.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks.
Thanks, Kathryn. Great moderating.
Thank you guys. Yes.
Thank you. Lauren, do you need anything else from us?
Okay. Nope, you guys are good to go.
Okay, bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, keep up the good work, ladies.
You too.
Take care, Kimball. It was a pleasure to meet you. I'm looking forward to following up.
Yeah, absolutely. You are.